Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this second in this series of Gresham lectures, which will continue for a 3-year period on religion and the liberal state. And of course, part of the set of institutions which comprise a liberal market order, liberal state, is the market order. And what I want to do in all of these lectures is really to explore the difficulties that people with religious faith have about various aspects of liberalism. And sometimes that's to do, as with this year, with issues to do with the free market. And in future years we'll be looking at things like equality and human rights and so forth, and how these impinge on those coming from faith communities, and particularly Christian communities, not because I don't think others are important, but it's just the one that I happen to know and am a member of. So the aim is really to try to interrogate the issues around various sort of pressure points between religious belief and aspects of the liberal state, including the role of the free market, which, as I say, is the topic for this series covering this academic year. And in the first lecture, a couple of months ago, a month or so ago, I stressed the extent to which, of course, a set of religious beliefs cannot have a direct impact on technical issues to do with the market economy. I mean, there is no, it seems to me, Christian view of how the LIBOR rate should be set, for example, except that it should be set in a trustworthy and legitimate kind of way. The role of faith in thinking about something like the market order is not to do with technical questions to do with the economy, so much as the moral issues that surround and underpin that order. And in the first lecture, I tried to distinguish between 3 sorts of moral concerns. The first is the sort of grounding of the market order in a set of moral considerations, that there are various moral underpinnings to an economic market, some of which I want to explore in later lectures, particularly the lecture on trust and markets. Then there are questions about the scope of markets, because obviously markets involve the production and exchange of commodities. And do we have any clear idea, and should there be a clear idea, about the kinds of goods that can be exchanged in markets or that ought to be exchanged in markets? Are there moral limits on what we can regard as commodities, and how would we think about those moral limits? And there will be a lecture later on again in the course on the kind of limitations on the idea of a commodity. And then there's the moral consequences of markets. What effect do markets have on ideas like justice, ideas like the common good, ideas like community, and so on, all of which have been of great concern to people from the faith communities. So the kind of underpinnings of markets, the scope of markets, the consequences of markets. And it's obviously true that at the moment there is quite a lot of rather general concern about the relationship between markets and morality. And this is not a particularly recent thing. I mean, it goes back to the 19th century, particularly, if not before. And in the 20th century, there were many Christian thinkers, I mean, William Temple perhaps being the foremost of them, and R.H. Tawney and various other people, Scott Holland, for example, who had grave concerns about the impact of a free market economy on things like justice, community, ideas of the common good, and so forth. But this is a rather generalised kind of concern, and what I aim to do in these lectures is to try to focus attention a lot more on very specific kinds of moral values. And today I want to focus on the idea of the relationship between markets and freedom and choice, because both defenders of free markets and also critics of free markets often, I think, don't really grapple with many of the complexities around the idea of freedom and choice, because these things are far from being simple, it seems to me. And if we're going to really get to grips with the moral issues at stake here, we have to have a very close understanding of the particular things that we're talking about, and in this particular context, it's the relationship between markets, freedom, and choice. What I'll do first of all is just to try and set out what the kind of pro-market case in respect of freedom is, and then to raise some questions about that case as I go along. So first of all, you need to understand the nature of freedom as it's usually invoked in defences of the free market order by some of the most prominent modern defenders of the idea of a liberal free market economy. I'm thinking of people like Friedrich von Hayek in his book The Constitution of Liberty, or in a more popular form, The Road to Serfdom, and Milton Friedman and James Buchanan and people like that, the really heavyweight defenders of the legitimacy and power of the free market economy. So what do they understand by freedom when they link the market economy and freedom? And unless we get to grips with this issue to start with, we won't really have much purchase. Whether we're defenders of the free market order or critics of it, we won't have much purchase on what's being said unless we really get to grips with the idea of freedom. And the central idea of freedom which they adopt is the idea that freedom is essentially negative. That is to say, it is freedom from. And what is freedom from? Well, it's freedom from coercion. That a person is free if he or she is not coerced into a form of action or a choice, in inverted commas, as it would be then. That freedom is the absence of coercion. And the job of a liberal market order is to provide a framework within which individuals can be free from coercion. So that's the kind of core idea, that freedom is the absence of coercion. But as we'll see, this becomes a much more complicated idea than it might first appear. But the first step, I think, to take to a proper understanding of the idea of freedom from coercion is this, that in the view of these defenders of the market order that I've cited, we have to distinguish between various kinds of things that impede what we want to do and impede our choices, some of which are the result of human action. I prevent you from doing what you want to do. You want to go to the cinema, I lock you in the house, and you're prevented from going into the cinema. That's a clear case of intentional coercion. But there can be other sorts of things that prevent you from doing things. So, for example, if there's been a huge fall of snow and your front door is blocked, you're equally prevented from going to the cinema. But in the view of defenders of the negative view of freedom, that isn't a limitation on freedom. It's certainly something that's preventing you from doing something. But coercion is to be understood as the intentional act of another human being. It's not the result of some kind of natural occurrence like a snowfall or whatever it might be. And this becomes more important than it might look at first sight. So my freedom can only be impeded by the intentional action of another person. I may be unable to go to the cinema, but being unable to go to the cinema is not the same thing as not being free to go to the cinema. And this is an absolutely crucial issue, as we'll see in a few minutes, that for the defender of the free market, there's a fundamental difference between being free to do something, which means that you're not prevented from doing it by the action of another, and whether you're able to do something which depends upon your resources, your intellectual qualities, and so on and so forth, and also the circumstances that surround you that are not the product of individual action. So the idea then is that freedom is the absence of coercion understood as the intentional action of another person. So a free society is framed by a set of laws which prevents mutual non-coercion. That's what a free society is. It's defined in terms of a set of laws which prevent individuals coercing one another. And that's crucial to the argument as we'll see it develop. So fairly simple issues to start with. The fundamental difference between freedom and ability, and the idea that free society is one defined by a set of laws which allow individuals to pursue their own good in their own way, free from the coercion of others. And of course that means that individuals in that sort of society will be equally free in terms of freedom of choice, that I can pursue my own good in my own way, and you are equally free to pursue your good in your way, subject to the proviso that when I pursue my own good, I'm not preventing you from pursuing your good, and equally when you're pursuing your good, you're not preventing me from pursuing my good. That we are all equally free, subject to, as I said, mutual non-coercion. And the argument then is that if we have a society in which we prevent people from coercing one another, then in such a situation, individuals will naturally engage in economic exchange. This is an idea, it's not a very deep idea, but it's an idea that goes back to Adam Smith in the early part of The Wealth of Nations, in which he argues that in a system of natural liberty, in which people don't coerce one another, then individuals will truck, barter, and exchange. That economic exchange is a fundamental form of negative liberty. That if we are not coercing one another, then we will naturally engage in economic activity and free exchange, and that therefore this kind of negative freedom, this freedom from coercion, is a precondition of the emergence of a market order. And without negative liberty, we won't have a market order. Now, alongside this, in modern defences of a free market, goes also the idea that morality, moral values, are a matter of individual choice as well. That many defenders of the free market are what are called moral subjectivists, that is to say, my set of moral values, whatever they are, is a matter of my choice, and yours are a matter of your choice. And not only that, but the value of an economic good or commodity is also determined by the interplay of choices in an economy. That there is no such thing as the real price of something, or the objective price of something, or the just price of something. The price of something is determined by, well, what we call supply and demand, or in another way of putting it, in terms of the theme of this lecture, by the free choices of individuals. I choose to put something on the market at a particular price, and you either choose to buy it or you choose not to buy it. There's no question of the real value being something other than what emerges out of those subjective choices. Now, that's sometimes generalised by defenders of the free market into this much more general idea that all values, not just economic values, but all values are a matter of free choice. And this has a big effect on the idea that I mentioned some time ago about whether there are limitations on what can be regarded as a commodity, or whether there are limitations on what can be regarded as something to be bought and sold in a market. So, for example, you might say, and let's say this will be a theme of another lecture, so I won't dwell on it particularly now, but you might say, if I own anything, I own my body, and therefore I should be free, if I want to sell particular bits of my body. I might decide that I want to sell my blood, or I might decide that I want to raise some money by selling a kidney, or sell my gene line, or something like that. That if I own my body, then why shouldn't, if I choose to, regard my body as a commodity, if the idea of value is a wholly subjective thing? And if others say, oh, no, this is utterly immoral, you can't regard your body or your person or yourself as a commodity in that way, well then that, in the view of these defenders of the idea of the subjectivity of value, that is to impose your subjective values on my subjective values by preventing me from treating my body and its parts as a set of commodities. You are substituting your choices for my choices, and that in a free and open market we should be able to trade anything which individuals choose to attach an economic value to. There is no such thing as a set of objective values that can be properly invoked to constrain my freedom of choice, my freedom of exchange, and so forth. And this isn't just some kind of theoretical concern. I mean, there are issues, quite major issues, to do in genetics with the ownership and commercial exploitation of what have been bodily parts, namely genetic lines and so forth. And there are areas of law that try to struggle and resolve these kinds of questions. So, if you say that value is subjective and purely a matter of choice, then it means, really, that there can be no obvious limits to markets. We can't say, because it would just be other people's choices, we can't say that such and such a thing is off limits to markets because of its nature, that it's not really a commodity. And I mean, lots of people feel uneasy about this, that health shouldn't be seen as a commodity, or education shouldn't be seen as a commodity, and so on. But the kind of fully blown free market position, as for example in the writings of the Nobel Prize-winning economist James Buchanan, these things would be just like commodities like anything else, because their value is a matter of subjective choice. They don't have some kind of objective Platonic value outside the choices of individuals. And why should your choice, which is to regard health as not being a commodity, supersede my choice, which is that it should be seen as a commodity? So the question of the subjectivity of value is very important here. Why should your choices supersede my choices? This then leads us on to a further and very important point, particularly in relation to thinking about this in the context, as I'll do a bit later on, in the context of the Christian tradition of sort of social and moral thought. Should we regard freedom and freedom of choice as being somehow a universal and intrinsically valuable thing in human life? Why should we want to elevate the idea of freedom to this absolutely central role? The only answer to that would seem to be that, well, freedom is some kind of universal, general, and perhaps in some sense intrinsic value. Well, this, first of all, of course, poses something of a difficulty that particularly energizes philosophers, but I won't go into it very much just today, that if morality is subjective, then isn't the choice in favour of the universality of freedom itself a subjective choice? And it may be your choice, it doesn't necessarily have to be mine. But let's leave that on one side for the moment. Is freedom to be seen as something that has intrinsic value, such that a market economy which facilitates freedom is in some sense part of this, of the achievement of that thing which is universally valuable, namely freedom? And following from that, in the writings of many sort of liberal thinkers in the past 40 or 50 years, has been the idea that human dignity resides in our capacity for choice, that that's what makes human beings what they are, and it's what human dignity is founded upon or rooted in, however you want to describe it. That human dignity is based upon our capacity for freedom, our capacity for choice. And that would fit into this idea that freedom is some kind of general and universal and perhaps objective or intrinsic value, however philosophically difficult that might be in the context of the idea of moral subjectivism. Now, this is a rather different idea, certainly from freedom as it was understood at the start of the liberal tradition in writers like John Locke, and also very much at odds with the kind of Christian tradition, because the alternative view is that freedom isn't some kind of intrinsically good thing, nor is it intrinsically about human dignity, but rather that freedom is an instrumental good. And that what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about freedom is that freedom is justified because it provides the framework within which we can then pursue those human goods that are central to the idea of the flourishing of individual human life. That freedom is valuable because in a free society we can then pursue what is good, not the other way around. The views I've been expounding so far, drawn from these liberal writers, is that freedom is the good in itself. It is a universal and general and intrinsic good. And that's what justifies markets. On this alternative view, freedom is good because it is a means to achieving the most basic and important goods of human life. And you may say, well, this sounds a very obscure kind of contrast, but I'll explore it a little bit more in a minute, because as we'll see, it is actually fairly vital. But there is also that same view held by some defenders of the free market, that in fact freedom is important as an instrument to other kinds of goods. So Hayek, for example, argues that why we need a free market and why we need freedom in the market is that without it, we won't be able to utilize our dispersed, our limited, our fragmentary knowledge. And unless we can use that knowledge in the way that we choose and the way that we want, we will not be able to act effectively in the world. And that because we all have very limited access to knowledge, however clever we might be, because of that limitation of our knowledge, if we are not free to utilize it, we will not be effective actors in the world, and humanity will, in aggregate, be much the poorer. So a free society for Hayek is justified not because freedom is somehow intrinsically good, but because it provides the framework within which we can pursue the realization of our own particular fragmented knowledge. It's not something valuable in itself. And he says quite clearly in the Constitution of Liberty, which is the great defense of the free market in the past century, in the Constitution of Liberty, he says, if we had more general and universal forms of knowledge, there would be no case whatsoever for a free society. Rather, freedom is justified because without it, we won't be able to put our individual fragmented and limited knowledge to effective use. So on this view, freedom becomes a kind of instrumental good. And in that sense, it has something in common with the Christian view and the early liberal view that freedom isn't a universal good in and of itself, but rather freedom provides the circumstances within which we can pursue the other great goods of human life. Now, let's just carry on with a slightly different theme, because I will be coming back to this in a minute. If you take the view that freedom is about mutual non-coercion, and that the market is one of the best examples of that, then what do we understand by an idea that's very commonly invoked by critics of the market? What do we understand by the idea of a common good? If you say that freedom is what defines the market and freedom is about mutual non-coercion, what then is the common good? Well, from this point of view, the common good is not about the goals and purposes that people have, because those are subjective. Now, I may choose a life of wine, women and song. You may choose a life of ascetic contemplation. These are ultimately matters of individual choice, and they are not capable of being arbitrated between, except when my pursuit of my good prevents you from pursuing your good. There is no common good in the sense of some set of common goals or common outcomes. Now, the alternative to that, the argument of the free marketeer is that the common good does exist, but it's being looked for in the wrong place. The common good is the sharing of the framework of order within which individuals are mutually non-coercive. That's the common good. It is the framework of law which defines freedom from coercion. It's not about agreement over purposes or over goods themselves. It is about the mutual absence of coercion. So in the view of free market defenders, when people in, for example, the Christian context say we should seek the common good, well, in the free market view, we are seeking the common good because the common good is the framework of mutual non-coercion, not an agreement on goals and purposes. They are subjective. They are a matter of choice. Rather, we should be concerned with the framework. If you like, the common good is a procedural good, not a good to do with outcomes. The common good is about the framework, not about the choices that are made within the framework. Final sort of general point on the pro-market case. The argument is that, as I said right at the beginning, when talking about you being unable to get out of your house, if it's the result of individual prevention, then that is coercion, but if it's a result of the snowfall, it isn't. In the view of the free market defender, we have to distinguish sharply between freedom and ability. That freedom is the absence of coercion. It's not about having the ability and the resources that might be needed to do what you choose to do. I am free to do whatever I am not prevented by the actions of another from doing. Whether I am able to do what I am free to do is a completely different question. My lack of resources which enable me to do or not to do whatever it is I want to do, that has got nothing to do with freedom. Freedom is just the absence of intentional coercion. It's got nothing to do with the possession or absence of resources. And the argument for this is a fairly simple one, namely that I am free to do everything that I am not prevented from doing, which means that you're free to do possibly an infinitely large number of things. If you tried to sit down this afternoon and make a list of the things that other people are not preventing you from doing, then you're going to be there until doomsday, because there is an infinite number of things that other people are not preventing you from doing. And you can twiddle your thumbs this way, you can twiddle your thumbs that way, you can count the hairs on the right-hand side of your head, the hairs on the left-hand side of your head. You know, there's just an indefinitely large number of things that you are not prevented from doing. But nobody, however rich or clever they are, is able to do other than a small number of the things that they are free to do. Now, if you accept that no one is able to do all that they're free to do, then freedom and ability must be separate things. So a free society, on this view, is about the framework of mutual non-coercion. It is not about creating more resources to enable people to do what they want to do. And there's a kind of political rub to this. So, for example, Sir Keith Joseph, one of Mrs. Thatcher's gurus, argued in his book on equality, drawing from Hayek in the 1970s, argued in the title of a chapter, that poverty is not unfreedom, that the lack of resources is not a limitation on freedom. Freedom is the absence of coercion. And not having the resources and therefore the ability to do something is not a restriction on your freedom. So we need to handle this argument about freedom and ability quite carefully. It's a complex issue. Now, so what can be said on the other side of this argument about freedom and markets? Well, quite a lot. And some of it will feature in future lectures. But the first thing I want to say is this, because it impacts precisely on this freedom and ability question. And it's this, and it's an argument owed to the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor in his essay, What's Wrong with Negative Liberty? And his argument is this, that if you think freedom is only about the absence of coercion, then this produces utterly unbelievable results, if you adopt that as a kind of principle, because it makes it more or less impossible to answer the question, which many defenders of the free market want to answer, namely, is this society a freer society than that society? Now, what would be the basis of judging whether society A is a freer society than society B? Well, if freedom is about the absence of coercion, then the answer must lie in the number of rules that prevent action in society A compared with the number of rules that prevent action in society B, which could lead to at least the implausible, if not utterly unbelievable conclusion that a primitive society is a much freer society than a developed society, because we live in a developed society in which there are umpteen rules preventing action in relation to all sorts of human activities, property rights, contract, taxation, transport, the whole range of things that characterize a developed society. Whereas a much more limited, much more underdeveloped society, because it won't have those things, it may have no financial sector, it may have no transport system, it may have no system for the transfer of property rights and so forth, that kind of society is going to be a freer society than one with rules that govern a whole range of developed human practices. You have to take that view, because what you can't do on the negative view of liberty is to invoke what people are able to do, because that would infringe the principle I've just talked about. It has to be a quantitative analysis of the number of rules preventing people from doing things. It's not a matter of saying, well, in our society, we're able to own property, we're able to do this, we're able to do that. That's got nothing to do with freedom on the view that we've just been looking at. But that is utterly unbelievable. Because, as Taylor points out, it would lead you to say that, in fact, if you go back, and his example is Enver Hoxha's Albania in the 1970s, it would lead you to say that because Albania was such a primitive kind of society, with virtually no transport system worth talking about, no financial system, no mechanism for owning property or transferring property and so on, there may have been far fewer rules in Albania than there were in the United Kingdom, and therefore, on this strictly negative view of freedom, Albania was a freer society than the United Kingdom. But this would be an absurd view. And why is it an absurd view? It's because we think freedom is connected to what we're able to do. We're able to participate in politics, we're able to criticise the government, we're able to emigrate, we're able to have a private life, and so on. That these things link freedom to an idea, first of all, of what we're able to do, and secondly, to the idea that there are certain kinds of things that we regard as being basically valuable. And what you can't do is to split freedom from the idea of those goods that help and develop and facilitate human flourishing. And that's what the Albanian example shows, that freedom has to be linked to an idea of what we're able to do and the value of those things that we're able to do. Now, of course, if you regard morality as entirely subjective, there is no case for saying that we have to share some idea of the valued ends, goals, and goods of human life, because these are just a matter of subjective choice. And the goods of human life are entirely criterion-less, that is to say, they can have no foundation. And then, if that's so, it leads you into enormous difficulties in trying to figure out whether one society is to be regarded as a free society, or for that matter, whether this individual is freer than that individual. Just doesn't apply. The opportunity of making these comparative judgments goes out of the window once you say that freedom has nothing to do with an idea of the good or the virtues that come from participating in a particular idea of the good. And this argument about there has to be some substantive idea of a common good also applies to coercion in the following way, and I'll make this point and then finish and see if there are any questions. And the argument about coercion is this, that if freedom, and this is absolutely central to the free market case, if freedom is just the absence of coercion, then clearly we have to have a pretty good idea of what coercion consists in. The difficulty of that is that coercion has to engage some moral ideas. It's not, In one sense, it doesn't, I have to say. I mean, in the example that I gave, I shut you in the house, you can't get out. That is physical coercion, and that is unproblematic. You are clearly being coerced. However, most coercion is not at all like that. Most coercion has to do with threats, and certainly the coercion of the law has to do with threats. If you park there, you'll be charged £50. If you do this, you'll go to prison for 10 years or whatever it might be. And of course, in ordinary relationships and family life and so forth, coercion has to do with threats. If you go out tonight, you're going to be grounded for a month or something like that. It's a threat to try to prevent somebody doing something. Now, if most coercion is about threats, then we have to invoke the idea of a value. Because if you threaten something of mine that I couldn't care less about, then your threat is pointless. It has no force. In order for a threat to be coercive, it has to be a threat against something that is valued. Now, if you want to say that a free society, and this framework of a free society, is one in which we're free from coercion, and coercion is to do with threats, and coercion is to do with threats to something valuable, then we cannot understand what a free society is unless there are certain goods that we hold in common, a threat against which is to be regarded by everybody as a form of coercion. Now, those sorts of goods that we hold in common, that define the general circumstances of coercion, cannot just be regarded as a subjective matter, and they are absolutely central to the idea of negative freedom. I'm not criticising negative freedom. What I'm doing is saying you can't make sense of it without the idea of coercion. You can't make sense of the idea of coercion without the idea of a threat, and you can't make sense of the idea of a threat without the idea of a set of goods which we share in common. And that's what the common good consists in, not just in a set of procedures. And that's why I think the Christian position is correct in saying that there has to be some sense of a common good in society, because if there isn't, that a set of shared goods that we all would agree with as being somehow basic goods of our common life, without that you can't make sense of the idea of coercion, which is crucial to the form of liberty that free market defenders invoke. Quite rightly, but they have to understand, they have to accept, it seems to me, that there then has to be a more substantive sense of the common good than the one that they're prepared to usually countenance. And you can make the same point in a slightly different way, because the second argument, particularly due to the American philosopher Robert Nozick, is that coercion is about my threat to your expected your expected idea of the is a threat to your expectations about how things should go. That there's a kind of, if I buy a ticket to the theatre, I expect to go to the theatre, and if you threaten me, then that going to the theatre is what I would normally expect to happen. So your threat to my going to the theatre is a threat in relation to a common expectation, an expected course of events, if you like. Well, again, this is only really a threat if the expected course of events is valued. If I couldn't give a damn about the expected course of events, then again, your threat is pointless. We cannot get away from the idea of coercion, threat, and shared values. And therefore the idea of the common good, it seems to me, is of vital importance. Then, very final point about freedom and ability. This cannot be right, the idea that freedom and ability are categorically different. It cannot be right, because if you take it's surely pointless, it's surely meaningless to ask whether someone is free or unfree to do something that no one at all can do. If I asked you, are you free to jump from here to New York? You would think I'd gone mad. I mean, it's a completely pointless question. The question of whether you're free or unfree to jump from this room to New York is a completely pointless issue. You are only free or unfree in relation to some generalized kind of human ability. And if you are only free or unfree in relation to some generalized human ability, then that ability is a necessary condition of determining whether someone is free or unfree. And if something is a necessary condition of something else, then they are not categorically different. So on this view, we have to think about what people are able to do in relation to freedom, and not just the absence of coercion. And the issue then becomes one of justice, which is the theme of the next lecture, about whether there is some kind of fair access to those sorts of things which, as it were, define generalized human abilities, like health, education, security, and so on. Again, I think coming indirectly back to the idea of a common good. So this isn't to be regarded, that what I'm saying isn't to be regarded as, in some sense, a root and branch critique of the idea of the liberal market economy. Far from it. I mean, I've tried to defend the idea of a free market economy in many places, but there's no point in producing arguments that don't actually work. And I don't think that basing the free market economy on an idea of negative freedom as being just the absence of coercion is a very fruitful way forward, and I've tried to give you reasons why that's so.